Hello, and welcome to lecture number 5 in the first IHF medical webinar series. My name is Courtney Gahan, and I am the moderator for this session this afternoon. Today we have 3 translation languages available: French, Spanish, and Arabic. You can use these if you are joining us on Zoom by locating the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and selecting the label for your language. This first IHF medical webinar series is part of the Virtual Academy launched recently by the IHF to enable global online learning and ultimately licensing. All of this is part of the IHF Education Center, which you can access online at ihfeducation.ihf.info. Today's lecture is presented by Professor Sebastien Racinais, Head of Research at Aspetar in Qatar, and focuses on the effect of environmental temperature on elite athletes. As always, please feel free to ask questions throughout the session, and we will stop to address as many of those as possible at the end. And please note this is being recorded, so you will be able to access it for on-demand viewing on the IHF Education Center, as well as on our Facebook page later. So, Professor Racinais, we are ready to begin when you are.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present some of our work on the effect of environmental temperature on the elite athletes. So today, I will go through 5 different questions. And the first one is, why is heat an issue? Because by talking about temperature, I will be talking mainly about heat. So why do we talk about heat? Why not about cold or about altitude or about other environmental stressors that your athlete can be exposed to? Then, after defining why we are talking about heat, we will talk about the consequences of heat exposure and heat stress, and then the specificities of team sports. Most of the people talking about the effect of heat are looking at cycling or running or different individual endurance sports. But today we'll be talking about team sports. And then we'll be talking about how to prepare and how to react. As a team physician, what can you do in case of any adverse event in the heat in one of your players? So first of all, why is heat an issue? So we all know, or we all believe at least, that human temperature is around 37 degrees. But there is nothing magic into this number. So if we look at other animal species, for example, they might have a different resting temperature than human. Some have a lower temperature, some have a higher temperature. But what is important is that no human species, no animal species have a temperature above 32, because there you get very close of the temperature where the protein that we have in our body, the protein that we have in our cells, will denaturate. On the other side of the spectrum, the cell will also be damaged by ice in case of freezing. But even in human, this temperature is not always 37. It will change. It will change, for example, during the day. This is what we call a circadian rhythm. And 37 is only the average. Actually, if you take the complete circadian rhythm over a 24-hour period, the average of the human temperature is more 36.7, so slightly below 37. But it changes with an amplitude of around 1 degree in between the early morning, where we have the lowest body temperature, and the late afternoon, where we have the highest body temperature. And what is important for us is that it also changes with exercise. So our resting temperature of around 37 or 36.7 will decrease with cold exposure and will increase with hot exposure or with exercise. And this is what is important for our athletes. If it decreases with cold exposure up to a temperature down to 27, then we are facing some severe hypothermia with various physiological consequences that ultimately can be fatal. But on the other side of the spectrum, if it increases to 42 Celsius degree, then we are facing severe hyperthermia, with also various physiological consequences that can also be fatal. And here, there is two important things to look at. The first thing is that our temperature of 37 at rest is much closer of what we will be defined as a severe hyperthermia to what will be defined as a severe hypothermia. So we are closer from the highest end than the lowest end of the spectrum. Secondly, temperature will increase with exercise. And exercise will actually be a more potent trigger to control temperature than cold exposure. So for example, if you exercise in a cold environment, your temperature will increase. It will not decrease despite the cold environment. We did some measures in winter sport, for example, in elite skiers, and despite training in an environmental temperature of 0 degree or even sub-zero, their core temperature is increasing due to the metabolic heat production during the exercise. So why does our temperature increase during exercise? So let's look a bit at our athlete and what happens when an athlete is exercising. So when we exercise, muscle contraction is producing heat. The human muscle have an efficiency of only 25%. That means only a quarter of the energy used during exercise is becoming movement, and 3/4 is becoming heat. This heat has to be dissipated in the environment. That can be done by radiation, but radiation is both positive and negative, depending if you're in the shade or under the sun, reflected radiation on the ground, and so on. So at the end, it's not an efficient way to thermoregulate. Heat can be dissipated by convections. Convection works well in a cold environment, when the temperature of the air is colder than the skin, but not so much in a hot environment, if the temperature of the air is as hot as the skin. So in a hot environment, the only way to thermoregulate is sweat evaporation. And this is very important here for two reasons. The first one is that when you are sweating, you are losing fluids. So associated to the thermoregulatory stress, there is generally also a problem of dehydration. The second reason why it is important is because sweat evaporation requires evaporation of the sweat. And evaporation is only possible if the air around the athlete is not saturated in water. So that means that exercising in a humid environment is actually much harder than exercising in a dry environment. So from the beginning, when I'm talking about exercising in the heat, it's actually a shortcut. By that, I mean exercising in hot and humid or hot and or humid ambient condition. We cannot dissociate the temperature and the humidity. So I will always be talking about exercising in the heat because it is shorter. But when I say that, what you have to hear is hot and humid ambient condition. Because if the sweat does not evaporate, if the sweat of the athlete drips on the floor, or if the athlete dries himself or herself with a towel, that does not help thermoregulation. Because this is not the fact of sweating that helps to eliminate heat. This is evaporation. Evaporation means changing from a liquid, the sweat is a liquid, to a gas. This change of state is using energy. This energy is thermal energy. So when the sweat that is a liquid is evaporating, it's becoming a gas, it uses energy, and this is this energy that cools down the body. So what is important also is that all of those ways to thermoregulate happen at the level of the skin. And to make a comparison with your car, to have something that will speak to everybody, you could consider the muscle of the athlete as the engine of the car. This is producing the power, but this is also producing heat. In your car, this heat is dissipated in front of the car at the level of the radiator and is carried from the engine to the radiator by the cooling liquid. In the human body, the heat is produced in the muscle and is dissipated in the environment at the level of the skin. The skin in the athlete is the same thing as the radiator in your car. And the heat is carried from the muscle to the skin using the blood flow. So the blood flow will actually act as a cooling system in your car. But here, there is a couple of issues with that. And the main one is that the blood going to the muscle is not going to the skin, or the blood going to the skin is not going to the muscle. In addition, the skin is a kind of a dead territory. It's a passive territory. And the blood that is going towards the skin will not come back to the heart, so will not participate in the ventricular refill in the same way than the blood going to the muscle. So actually, due to the skin demand in terms of increasing skin blood flow for thermoregulation purpose, that will induce a decrease in stroke volume because there is a decrease in ventricular refill when we exercise in the heat. So decrease in stroke volume can be partly compensated by an increase in heart rate in order to have the same cardiac output. But that will be valid only during a submaximal exercise intensity. So if an athlete is exercising at a submaximal intensity, he will have a higher heart rate to compensate for the lower stroke volume in order to maintain the cardiac output. Unfortunately, this compensation is very limited, and the higher the heart rate, the lower the ventricular refill, and then the lower the stroke volume also. So during a maximal exercise, the cardiac output will be lower. The consequences of that are multiple. If you are a physiologist or a coach or an athlete or a doctor, one of the first things you will notice is that your maximum heart rate is actually higher when you exercise in the heat. The maximum heart rate that some of you may have measured in a laboratory during an incremental test is actually a value that is contextual. And athletes can reach higher maximal heart rate when they are in the heat than what you will measure in a laboratory during a maximal test. If you are a physiologist, you will also consider that the thermal stress is actually a progressive cardiovascular stress. And if you are a coach, what you will notice is a decrease in the absolute exercise capacity of the athlete. So, what are the consequences of this thermal that is actually also cardiovascular stress? First, there is consequences on the health of the athlete. Environmental heat exposure is a serious health hazard that is responsible for more death than all other natural disasters combined. If you think to it, all other natural disaster means tsunami, fire, flooding, tornado, hurricane. All of these big disasters that are making the headline in the press, all of them combined kill less people every year than heat stress alone. So heat stress is a serious health hazard. But then you will tell me, yes, but most of the people suffering from a heat stroke are vulnerable population, mainly child and elderly people. And you're right, most of the victims of heat stroke are generally child or elderly people. Unfortunately, a standard case of heat stroke is about a child being left in a car, times the parents go for shopping or something like that, and then they are just victims of a heat stroke within the car. But, as we said, even if athletes are fit and are not victims of the standard heat stroke, they have a specific problem, is that they are producing heat themselves when they exercise. And due to that, they are victims of a specific case of heat stroke that we call the exertional heat stroke. That is slightly different than the classical heat stroke, but that is also deadly. And to give you some numbers, depending on the epidemiological study, is generally considered as the first or the second case of death in sport. Some people consider that this is a second case after cardiac condition in sport, and some other studies have considered that it's actually more prevalent than cardiac issue in sport. So this is a very, very serious hazard and a very serious problem in athletes. In addition of having consequences on health, it also has consequences on performance. So for example, in this retrospective study, Joshua Guy and collaborator look at 7 World Athletic Championships in between 1999 and 2011. And what they did is that they separated the World Championships that were held with a temperature above 25 degrees to the one held with a temperature below 25 degrees. And what they observed is that for sprint events, performance was actually better when the World Champs were held in hot ambient conditions. But this benefic effect of the heat disappeared for middle endurance event, and it became highly detrimental for the longest event. In that study, the longest event that was investigated was a marathon. So since we completed a bit this study by looking at all World Championships since 1983 up to 2017, as well as all Olympics during the same period. So a total of 16 athletic World Championships and 9 Summer Olympics. And we also look at all events, including race walk and so on. And we observe the same thing. We observe that sprint events were actually better, were improved when temperature was improving, whereas endurance events were impaired when temperature was increasing. And what you can see here is that the relation is not linear. So once you reach a given threshold where the performance is impaired, it does not get more impaired by being a longer event. So the 50K race walk, for example, that is an event of 4 hours or more, is not altered more than the 20K race walk, that is an event of 1 hour and a half only. And the reason for that is that the problem of the athlete exercising in the heat is not being passively exposed to the heat. This is about the heat production. And heat production depends on exercise intensity. The shorter the exercise, the higher the intensity. So actually, middle duration exercise that have both a duration long enough to accumulate heat and an intensity high enough to produce a lot of heat have a level of risk that is as elevated than the longest duration exercise where the intensity is slightly lower. So a decrease in performance depending on the duration of the event. And this is the same thing during an event. This time we look at some data during cycling. We can see that actually the performance is not only decreasing when events get longer, but it's also decreasing during the event itself. What you can see here on the blue curve is a time trial done by cyclists in a cool environment. They did this time trial in Denmark in an ambient temperature of 8 Celsius degrees. Then they flew to Qatar, and on the first day of heat exposure, without any training in the heat, they made a similar time trial. And you can see that they were actually able to start the time trial at the same power output that they usually do, despite the heat. But progressively, the power output had to decrease more than it decreased normally in temperate environment, and the overall performance was impaired by hot ambient conditions. What is true for running and for cycling is also true for team sports. For example, here, we compared the activity during a football game played either in a temperate environment, 21 Celsius degree, or in hot ambient condition, 43 Celsius degree. So we can see that in both cases, the core temperature of the athlete, of the players, increased during the game because they produce heat, but the temperature increased more when they play in the heat because even if they produce the same amount of heat, it was harder to dissipate the heat in the environment, so their core temperature increased more. And the consequence of that, same as running, same as cycling, is a decrease in the exercise capacity. For example, the total distance covered during a football game in hot ambient condition was, in average, around 6% lower than during a game in cool ambient condition. And this was mainly the high intensity activity that was decreased. So the decrease in total distance was actually due to a decrease in the high intensity distance, with a decrease in high intensity of 26% in between the game playing in the heat versus the game playing in cool ambient condition. And we did the same kind of observation at the highest level. So most of you are working with high level. So we did the same kind of observation, for example, during the FIFA World Cup in Brazil in 2014. And what you can see here is the amount of activity based on the WBGT during the game. So WBGT means wet bulb globe temperature. This is a global index that takes into account the temperature, the humidity, and the radiation of the sun, all in a single value. This is a way to characterize the level of thermal stress. And what you can see here is actually when thermal stress increases, the amount of exercise at high intensity, the black triangle, decrease. So what has been observed in high intensity during the World Cup back up the data that we have observed previously in some research. But when we look at team sport, there is other parameters to consider than only the distance covered on the field. So what are the specificity of team sport? So before to move to handball, first, when we talk about heat stress and team sport, most of the people are first considering American football. Because American football has the specificity to be played with protective equipment. And the problem of the protective equipment is that limits even more the capacity to thermoregulate. In addition, the calendar of the season in American football is done in a way that all teams are having their preseason camp in August, in the middle of the summer, under the heat of August, before to start the season. And these preseason camps are always very, very intense. So if you add up the intensity of the heat production during the preseason camp to the ambient heat plus to the protective clothing, limiting the capacity to dissipate the heat, you end up with quite a dramatic combo. And unfortunately, those pictures are some famous players who died during training while playing American football. An epidemiological study, even if American football is considered as a very traumatic sport with a lot of contact, still, the risk of non-traumatic fatalities is 2 times higher in high school and 4 times higher in college than the risk of traumatic fatalities. So even in a very traumatic sport, the non-traumatic fatalities are actually higher than the traumatic fatalities. Most of them, around half of them, are due to sudden cardiac arrest. And then the second step of the podium, if I can say it like that, is unfortunately the exertional heat stroke. So exertional heat stroke is responsible for 1/4 of the death in American football. Then it's followed by other kind of exertional stroke, sometimes associated with sickle cell trait, asthma, and hyponatremia that is also related to training in the heat. But let's forget about American football that is very specific with protective clothing. So let's go back to the European football, or soccer, as we say, our American colleagues. So I previously showed you this slide showing a decrease in the distance covered by the player. But in this study, we also look at some specific parameter to team sport. And here, what was very interesting is even if we get a decrease in the total distance, we also get an increase in the sprint speed and an increase in the rate of successful passes. So what does that mean? That means that the game in the heat is not altered in the sense that not everything is altered. So total distance is reduced, but the sprint speed and the rate of successful passes or crosses is actually improved. So what that means? That means you need to adapt your game strategy to the environmental condition. If your strategy is based on a lot of running, this is a recipe for failure in the heat. But if you base your game strategy on a lot of passes, then this is a recipe for success playing in the heat. So as a coach, you need to apply your game strategy to the environmental condition. And the same thing was true also during the World Cup. If we look at all of the games during the Brazil World Cup, we could see also an increase in the rate of successful passes in the hottest game as compared to the game played with a lower level of heat stress. What about the beach sport? Because handball is also a beach sport. So unfortunately, at the date of today, there is not so much data available about beach handball. But we have some good data available in beach volleyball. And this is thanks to the International Volleyball Federation that implement a heat stress monitoring program. This heat stress monitoring program started 11 years ago. And for 11 years, for every single beach volleyball matches from the World Tour or the World Champ, the referee has measured the environmental temperature on the pitch before the game, as well as record every single medical timeout asked by any team, and in case of medical timeout, have recorded if this medical timeout was related to heat or not. And analyzing this kind of data, so over 11 years, we obtained 8,530 matches. So that's a lot of data that could be obtained. And this is very interesting because that allows us to see the specificity of team sport. So I mentioned in my introduction that sweat evaporation was a primary way to thermoregulate. So that means that in endurance sport, when you produce a lot of heat, humidity is actually more important than temperature. But in beach volleyball, this is the contrary. Temperature was actually more important than humidity in order to predict the risk of heat stress. So this is very important to consider that we cannot simply transfer our knowledge from endurance sport or from the laboratory to team sport. And team sport may have different requirements than endurance sport. What about indoor team sport? So here, there is unfortunately very few data available about what's going on in indoor team sport, because it is generally considered that indoor sports are not exposed to the heat. And this is a mistake to make this shortcut. This is a mistake for different reasons. First one, if I consider the Tokyo Olympics, your athlete will not go there straight from the plane to the handball hall, play their game, and then go back home. They will be there for 2 weeks. During these 2 weeks, they will be training and living there. So they will be exposed to the heat, either during training or out of training, during their outdoor activity. And it will not be possible to avoid heat exposure. This heat exposure will have some consequences in terms of, for example, accumulated fatigue on the athlete. So if your athletes are not ready for the ambient heat in Tokyo, even if they play indoor, this heat will have a detrimental effect for them. So that means that even indoor athletes need to prepare for the heat before to go to Tokyo. Secondly, most of the court will not benefit of AC. When you play at the highest level in some fancy area, you have AC, but most of the amateur players will not have any AC, and it can be actually very hot in some indoor court in the summertime in a gymnasium. So even indoor sport should consider the heat. Secondly, heat stress is not only about ambient heat. Heat stress is about the heat produced by the athlete, as we said during the introduction. And a very good example for that is a measure we did very recently during the World Championship 2019 in Doha. As you may remember, the road events were done outside under the heat, but the stadium events were done in a stadium with AC. So that actually the ambient conditions for the event were pretty chilly. It was around 24 degrees for the 10,000 meters. And this is a very short event of 28 minutes or less. And despite the event being pretty short and the condition being with AC, still athletes reach a core temperature of 40.5 Celsius degree. That is a definition, clinical definition for a diagnostic of heat stroke. So even if your athletes are playing with AC, they will be producing a lot of heat due to exercise intensity, so their temperature will be reaching very high values. So how can we prepare for this heat? The first thing to acknowledge is that it is possible to prepare. And that's the most important thing to remember from this presentation, is that we can prepare to the heat. What you can see here on this slide, on the left videos, is the arrival of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Women Marathon, with the arrival of the Swiss candidate, Gabriela Anderson-Chase, displaying all the standard symptoms of heat stroke with an alteration of her gait, suggesting an alteration in the central nervous system. Then what you can see on the right video of the slide, this is the arrival of the Beijing 2008 marathon at the Olympics. In Beijing in 2008, everybody was saying that it would be impossible to run a fast marathon due to the hot and humid ambient condition. And still, Samuel Wanjiru from Kenya established a new Olympic record in 2 hours and 6 minutes. And this is still the Olympic record. So despite the hot ambient condition, it was possible to do an exceptional performance in this condition. So this clearly shows that this is possible to exercise in the heat, but you need to be prepared for that. How to prepare? So let's go back to this slide that I showed you before. I told you that this was Danish cyclist who did a time trial, the blue curve in Denmark, then flew to Qatar and did a time trial in the heat on the first day of arrival in Qatar. And performance was dramatically decreased by hot ambient conditions. But then we allow those cyclists to train for 1 week in the heat. And you can see on the orange curve that they already recover half of the decrement in performance. Then they train for a 2nd week in the heat. And then they recover almost the totality of the decrease in performance. Actually, the performance in terms of speed was even better on the green curve after 2 weeks in the heat than on the blue curve. Because heat is a bit as altitude, is decreasing the air density, so decreasing the aerodynamic resistance, so you can go faster for a lower power output. So what is true for endurance sport is also true for team sport players. So I told you before that when you play in the heat, you have an average decrement of around 6% in the total distance covered during a game. But this is an average decrement for the 2 teams on the pitch. And there is a lot of inter-individual variation here. And what is important is that those athletes were allowed to train for 1 week in the heat. So 1 week, something that is enough to recover a part of the decrement, but not the totality of it, as we can see here. But what is interesting is that if we look at the physiological adaptation during that week of training in the heat, some players had a large decrease in hematocrit, suggesting a plasma volume expansion. That is one of the adaptations to heat. Whereas other players have absolutely no decrease in hematocrit. They are in the -3 to +3% range of the error of measure, suggesting no adaptation yet in those players after a week. And one player even have a negative response with an increase in hematocrit, suggesting a hemoconcentration, so dehydration with training in the heat. And those 2 parameters are very well related. So the players that were able to increase their plasma volume to adapt to the heat after 1 week were actually able to maintain their activity when playing in the heat. Whereas the players who did not adapt yet had to decrease their activity, and the player who had an adverse reaction because likely of dehydration when training in the heat is a player who had to decrease the most his activity during the game. So this is possible to adapt, but you have to give a chance to every single player to adapt. And some of them may need 1 week, some of them may need 2 weeks. Some of them may even need 3 weeks. This adaptation will be beneficial for exercise capacity and their performance. And these adaptations will also be beneficial for their health. For example, what you can see here on the table on the left is measurements that have been done in Melbourne during 2 triathlons. And in Melbourne, they are organizing 2 triathlons on the same course 3 months apart. In December, that is the beginning of the summer in the South Hemisphere, and in February, that is the middle of the summer there. And on this year, the 2 races were done with almost the same ambient condition. But in December, it was the first heat wave, the first hot day of the year. And you can see that the day before, temperature was 10 degrees lower than on race day. So the participants were not used to the heat. As a consequence, 15 of them collapsed, and 3 of them have a severe heat stroke. 3 months later, same condition, but this time it was seasonal temperature. This time, no athlete collapsed. Same race, same course, but no collapse in the same condition. And this effect of being used to the heat and the seasonality of the temperature is the same in team sport. So what you can see on the table of the right part of the slide is every single case of medical time out due to the heat during 11 years of heat stress monitoring at the International Volleyball Federation Beach Volleyball World Tour. And we can see that there is actually a higher prevalence of medical time out due to the heat in the 4th quarter of the year when the game is played by players from Europe going for a tournament in Asia, mainly in Thailand. That means when players go from Europe, when it's the summer in Europe, to Asia, they're at lower risk when they go there than if they go there in the winter time. Because when you go to Asia coming from Europe in the winter, you're not used to the heat, and then you get suddenly exposed to the heat and have to play in the heat. So this is a risk factor of not being used to the heat. So why training in the heat is protecting the athlete is because humans will adapt to train in the heat. This is what we call heat acclimation. And after a few days of training in the heat, we will have an increase in sweat rate that will allow to better thermoregulate, because we said that sweat evaporation is the main way to thermoregulate. In addition, we will sweat more, but we will have less sodium in the sweat. That means we'll be able to better retain the electrolyte. Despite more sweating to better thermoregulate, we have lower loss of electrolyte. So that will allow to decrease the core and skin temperature. We'll also have an increase in plasma volume that will increase the blood volume, allowing to send more blood to the skin for thermoregulation while having a better ventricular refill. As such, we will have a decrease in heart rate. So we have an increase in thermal comfort and an increase in exercise capacity. And what is important on this graph is the x-axis. As you can see here, those adaptations happen in a few days only. So you don't need months or years of training in the heat to get used to the heat. You just need a few days. 2 weeks of training in the heat is enough to be able to cope with the heat. Despite the importance of training in the heat, this is not standard yet in the athlete community. So for example, in 2015, at the World Championship in Beijing, we made a survey to the elite athletes participating there, to the Athletic World Championship, and only 15% of them had a dedicated acclimation period of 15 to 13 days. We made the same survey the following year for the Cycling World Championship. Then we discovered that 61% of the athletes have some form of heat exposure, but only 38% are dedicated plan. But it's still better than 15%, so we are getting there. We did the same thing in 2019, and again, those numbers are increasing, with 78% of the endurance athletes having some form of heat exposure, and 55% having a proper heat preparation plan. So you see, years after years, we are getting there, and athletes are training more and more in the heat. The numbers are not perfect yet. We are aiming to have 100% of the athletes having a proper preparation, but we are getting there. And athlete education is very important for that. And this is also what we are working on with the IOC, where we release the Beat the Heat campaign with various flyers being distributed, as well as some information on the website. So if you go on the Athlete 365 portal, that is a portal for all of the athletes participating to the Olympics, there is a big section called Beat the Heat with various recommendations about how to train in the heat. and various simple tips about how to do it. For example, how to do it if you are living in a cold country, and then there is various suggestions about how you can generate heat without being in a hot country to prepare to the heat. Then also there is various suggestions about when to do it, because if you are a coach, how can you integrate that into your planning? And there is also various suggestions about how to do it. You can do it 1 month before, you can do it just before to fly, you can do it after flying. There is several ways to do it. But the key message is you need to do it. Because there is several ways to do it, because it's easy to do it, there is no excuses to don't do it. So you need to train in the heat, you need to acclimate to protect the health and performance of your athlete. And there is absolutely no excuses for not training in the heat before an event such as Tokyo. Then, if despite all this training in the heat, there is still an adverse event, what do you need to do as a coach or as a team physician? How to react to heat stroke? Here, the key message is time. Consider that when an athlete is suffering from heat stroke, you have 30 minutes, no more. All the athletes for whom heat stroke have been reverted in less than 30 minutes have recovered from it without any sequela. If you need an hour to recover from heat stroke, there is a high probability of sequela with probably several organ failure that may require several organ transplant. And there is cases of athletes who have stayed in the coma for a long time, or at least have stayed hospitalized for a very long period, requiring multiple organ transplant. That is for 1 hour. If you go above 1 hour, if you need 2 hours to reverse heat stroke, then unfortunately, most of the time, the outcome is death of the athlete. So key is time. You have 30 minutes. 30 minutes not to start the cooling, 30 minutes to cool down the athlete. So you need to start the cooling much before that. And to do that, you need to rely on 4 principles. The first one is that you need an early recognition. Early recognition on the field. So if it's, for example, a road race on the field, you need to have a spotter at different locations around the field able to witness and alert immediately in case of an athlete collapsing. It's a bit easier in handball because you can supervise the entire pool from a single spot. And you also need early recognition once under medical supervision. So the first thing to consider is always CPR if an athlete is in cardiac arrest or respiratory arrest. But second to that, immediately the second thing to consider is heat stroke. If an athlete do not require CPR and cardiac massage, the second thing to consider in terms of priority and risk for the life of your athlete is a heat stroke. So you need to measure the temperature of your athlete. And this is the second point. After an early recognition, to consider heat stroke very early, this is an early diagnosis. And here I would like to say thank you to Douglas Casa from the Curry Springer Institute to formalize these 4 principal steps. And who also determined that the only way to have something that is both valid and logistic feasible in terms of diagnosis is to have rectal temperature. This is the only one that is both valid and logistically feasible in a clinic in order to confirm a diagnostic of heat stroke. So early diagnosis, early recognition followed by early diagnosis in order to start the treatment as fast as possible. In terms of treatment, the best way to cool your athlete is cold water immersion. What you can see here is a comparison of different ways to cool the athlete. And cold water immersion, especially ice water immersion, is clearly the most efficient way to cool down rapidly an athlete. And all the team doctor or all the doctors who will be present in Tokyo for the organizing committee have been trained about how to carry an athlete to a cold bath and how to cool an athlete in an ice bath. In addition, on all the venues at risk, there will be dedicated heat deck with cold bath and a special team of physicians trained on managing cooling of athletes and managing heat stroke that will be available on the various Olympic venues in order to treat your athlete. And the last point, the last principle is on-site cooling. Because we need rapid cooling, that means we need to start cooling on the sport venue before arrival of the paramedic or of the emergency service. Because if your first reflex is to call for an ambulance, that is a good reflex. But if you wait for the ambulance, you will have 5 minutes to call, 10 minutes to arrive, 10 minutes on site, 10 minutes to arrive at the hospital. And at the hospital, they generally need to prepare the bath because the bath is not ready, so 10 minutes more. It's a total of 45 minutes before to start cooling. That means the cooling will take 1 hour. So there is a high risk of organ failure. Remember that we want to cool before 30 minutes. So that means cool first, transport second. You don't need an ambulance, you don't need to be in an hospital to cool. If one of your athletes is victim of a heat stroke, you cool first. Even if you're not a doctor, even if you're a paramedic, even if you're a coach, you cool first, you transport second. This is very important to cool a hyperthermic athlete without waiting. So, in summary, why is heat an issue? Heat is an issue more than cold because athletes produce heat. So even if you exercise in the cold, cold is never an issue because the athlete is producing heat that allow him to fight against the cold. But when you exercise in the heat produced by the athlete is harder to dissipate. You do not produce more heat, it's just harder to dissipate. Due to that, the temperature increases. What are the consequences of this increase in temperature? Consequences are both for performance, with a decrease in exercise capacity, a progressive decrease in exercise capacity, I should say, because if you're just doing a sprint, there is no issue. It's just over time, when exercise prolonged, that the performance will decrease. And a higher risk of exertional heat illness or exertional heat stroke in your athlete also. What are the specificities of team sport? So even if the exercise capacity decrease, that is visible through a decrease in total activity and mainly through high intensity activity during the game, still there is some positive side with an increase in the sprint speed or an increase in the successful rate of successful passes. And both are linked because if you run less, means your opponent is also running less. So you have less pressure from the opposing team, so you have more time to adjust and receive your passes. So that means you need to adapt your strategy to the environmental condition. Then how to prepare for the heat is very simple, is train in the heat. If you plan to compete in the heat, you need to train in the heat. That's a basic principle of specificity for a coach, but that is unfortunately not always applied. I would cite Franklin Roosevelt on that, who said, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. This is exactly that when you talk about heat acclimation and a competition in the heat. Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. So if you plan to compete in the heat, you need to train in the heat. That is non-negotiable. And then, if despite all of this preparation, you still have an adverse event in the heat, how to react? The reaction is just cool. Cool your athlete. Don't wait, cool. Your athlete needs to be cooled in less than 30 minutes. If he spends more than 30 minutes in a hyperthermic state, he will probably have some organ failure and organ damage. If he spends more than an hour in a hyperthermic state, he's at a high risk of death. So you cool your athlete rapidly, aggressively. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple of questions. Somebody asked if the only way of cooling the athlete on site is to use cool bags. What are the key areas of the body to place them on?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So first, whatever you have, you use it. As I said, the best way to cool is to use a cold bath. If you do not have a cold bath, it's not a reason to don't do anything. So what you can do first is to remove the athlete from the heat. So you can go to the changing room. In the changing room, we generally have access to a shower. So you can generally access to a cold shower. So you can use your cold bath, your cold bag in addition of a cold shower that will also allow to have cold water on the athlete. If you only have the cold bath and if you don't have access to a changing room with a shade, AC and a shower, then you try to cover as much skin as possible. So first you remove the clothing. You don't put the cold bath on a t-shirt. You put the cold bag directly on the skin. You remove the clothing. Then in terms of the area, the higher area, the best, clearly. If you have to select because you just have a few cold baths, so there is a few areas with a lot of vascularization, such as the palm of the hand is having a lot of vascularization, so can be an efficient area. The back of the neck is efficient also for the perception of the athlete, for the athlete to feel better. But playing on perception is sometimes a double-edged sword because it's not about the athlete feeling better here, it's mainly about cooling the athlete. So you can go also, some people will choose to go on axillary area. Some people will go to see on this area also where you have the brachial artery that is easily accessible, so that you can cool down at the level of the brachial artery. It's actually what pediatrics will do. It's what you do on child. That's a pediatric response to heat stroke is to cool down specific areas such as here or at the level of the foot and so on. But in adult, go for the highest area possible. Go, put your athlete under the shower as well and under the shade. Simple things that are normally always available.
Okay, and somebody else asked if there's any variance in resistance and adaptation to heat based on race, or is this more, so, is there any variation here?
There is inter-individual differences. Some people have been looking at is there difference between men and women. Some others have been looking at difference between adult and child. Some others have been looking at differences depending of ethnicity. Is it the same if you're coming from a hot country than if you're coming from a cold country? At the end of the day, all the differences that exist between people are quite marginal as compared to the effect of heat itself and the human capacity to adapt. So even if you may have a few % of differences between different people, still heat will play, for example, heat will decrease the performance by around 15% during a 1 hour exercise. So even if you have a couple of the % of difference between individuals, this is very minor as compared to the effect of heat. But the most important is that everybody is able to adapt. There is no such thing as responder and non-responder to heat. Every human is able to adapt to the heat. Human is a tropical animal originally. We come from African area. We have been able to colonize the entire planet due to some behavioral adaptation, allowing us to adapt to the cold. But the way humans adapt to the cold is by technology. So humans learn to build clothing. Humans learn to master the fire. Humans learn to build shelter. So we are able to build shelter, clothing, fire. But for the heat, the way we are able to tolerate the heat is about physiological adaptation. And all humans are able to adapt to the heat. So if somebody is having an advantage because he's coming from a hot country, this advantage will disappear very rapidly because everybody can adapt to the heat in a few days only. In a couple of weeks, even somebody from a cold country, will be adapted to the heat as well as anybody from a hot country can be.
Okay, and one more question. Somebody asked about monitoring the temperature of the players during a handball game. Mm-hmm. If their temperature is over 32 degrees, should we stop the game? Is this something we should be considering?
So that's a very, let's say, contentious debate. There is two things that can be moderated during a game. The first one is the environmental condition. The second one is the temperature of the player itself. And I will start by the second one because there is recent progress in technology allowing to monitor the temperature of an athlete. And as I mentioned, clinical diagnostic for heat stroke is a core temperature of 40.5 degrees plus central nervous system dysfunction. That means that if your athlete is only displaying a core temperature above 40.5 degrees, do not stop him. That will be unethical to stop an athlete based on his temperature only. And that's a bigger ethics problem that is now being created by all this new technology being available, because we may witness athlete being hyperthermic. Then we have to take a decision. Do we stop him? But maybe he was winning a medal, and then you will withdraw him from a race where he was winning a medal. So you will get a complaint from the athlete and his team. But maybe you will not stop him, and then something will happen to him. And they will tell you, but you know he was hyperthermic. Why you did not stop him? So it's very important to have a sensitive judgment based on temperature, but also on the athlete response. And there is several cases of athletes who have not been stopped despite collapsing on the pitch. So this is why what we need to consider the clinical symptom in addition of the temperature. Then regarding the ambient temperature, then it's a bit easier because you choose to stop a game. So you don't stop one athlete. You're not unfair for one athlete versus the other. You just choose to stop the game. Several federations have rules in this sense, either to modify the rule of the game. So for example, the FIFA allow an additional break after 30 minutes of each half if the WBGT is above 32. So it's a 3-minute break where the athlete can drink, cool a bit, and then they go for the 15 last minutes of the half. Tennis having a similar rules. If the WBGT reach 30, they will allow for a bigger break between the set, and if it reach 32, they will stop for wheelchair player and junior player and give big break on the ATP tour. So some federations are having rule in this sense, but I don't think that the AHF is having any rule in that sense.
Okay, yes, that is all the questions that we have. So we can wrap up there. Thank you so much, Professor. This was very interesting.
My pleasure.
So just to tell everyone what we have coming up next week, as we're back again next Tuesday with a focus on handball injuries, causes and outline of treatments. That is with Professor Yassine Zaghini, orthopedic surgery, sport trauma at the FIFA Medical Center of Excellence in Algiers, and also part of the medical committee for the FIFA and Confederation of African Football. So we'll be back again next Tuesday. Thank you once again, Professor. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you soon.